They found her the way a man finds a debt he didn't know he owed, buried under something ordinary, waiting to be uncovered. He pulled back the canvas, expecting feed sacks. He found a woman instead, curled small as she could make herself, which was not small at all, and so cold her lips had gone the color of a bruise. He would spend the next 5 months learning that this was only the first thing she'd hidden from him. The morning of October the 9th came in gray and mean, the kind of Wyoming dawn that promised snow before it promised light. He had left the ranch before 4, the wagon wheels cracking through the first hard frost of the season, headed for Split Creek to haul back what winter stores the general store hadn't already sold to men with faster money. He had made the trip alone. He always made the trip alone. 11 years of running 400 head with one hired hand had taught him that solitude was cheaper than most things, and safer than all of them. 3 miles out from town, the near ox balked, and he climbed down to see what had spooked it, and that was when he heard the breathing. Not the ox's, hers. He stood a long moment with his hand on the canvas, the cold biting through his glove, and did the arithmetic a careful man does before he touches something he doesn't understand. Then he lifted the flap. She did not wake gently. She came up swinging one arm before her eyes were even open, as though she'd learned that waking meant defending herself, and he caught her wrist without meaning to, the way he'd catch a calf that bolted, out of reflex more than intention. Her eyes, when they finally focused on him, held no surprise. Only a tired kind of resignation, as if she'd expected to be found and dreaded it exactly this much. "You're on my grain," he said, because it was the only true thing he could think to say. "Then I'll get off it," she answered, and tried, and could not, because her legs had gone to wood in the cold and would not hold her. He noticed her hands first, how they were chapped and scarred along the knuckles in the particular pattern of a woman who had spent years close to hot iron and boiling water. He noticed the tin box she kept pressed to her ribs, even as she fought to sit up, gripped the way a soldier grips a rifle, not for use, but because letting go was unthinkable. He noticed she was heavy with more than cold and hunger, though he did not let his eyes linger there, out of some instinct toward decency he could not have named. He noticed all of this before he noticed she was afraid of him. That came last, and it was the thing, more than any of the rest, that decided what he did next. He did not reach for her the way a man reaches for a stray calf, all quick hands and rope. He backed off half a step instead, the way he might have backed off a spooked mare, and let the space between them do its slow work. "I mean you no harm," he said. "Cold's the only enemy out here this morning." She studied him with the flat, assessing look of someone who had learned that men's intentions were best judged by their hands, and not their words. His hands stayed at his sides. That seemed to matter to her, though she said nothing about it. He asked her name. She gave it, plain, without elaboration. The way a person gives up something they've decided is no longer worth guarding. He did not ask what had put her 3 miles from town on a morning cold enough to crack water buckets, though the question sat behind his teeth. He had learned, in 11 years of solitary ranching, that some doors opened faster if you didn't knock on them straight away. Instead, he asked if she could walk to the front of the wagon, where the horses would block some wind. She said she could try. Trying, it turned out, meant he had to half lift her by the elbow, and even that much contact seemed to cost her something. A flinch, quickly smoothed over, a held breath let out slow through her nose. He noted it, and set it aside the way he set aside a horse's bad leg, or a fence post gone soft at the base. Information, not judgment. Not yet. The tin box never left her grip. When he finally got her settled against the wagon's seatboard, wrapped in the old horse blanket he kept behind the bench, she arranged the box in her lap with both hands still on its lid, as if the cold itself might try to pry it open. "Recipe cards," she said, before he'd asked, answering a question he hadn't spoken aloud. "My mother's." He nodded, like a man accepting the weight of a fact he didn't yet understand the shape of. He had buried his own mother's Bible in a similar way once. Carried, not read. Held, because holding it was easier than admitting what its owner's absence meant. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and turned the team back toward the ranch, rather than on to Split Creek, though he told himself this was only practical. The ranch was closer. The horses were tired. The woman needed heat before she needed anything else. He did not examine why the thought of driving her back into town, to whatever had put her in his wagon, sat wrong in his chest like a swallowed stone. She did not thank him. She only watched the road, her knuckles white on the tin lid, and said, so quiet he nearly missed it under the wagon's creak, "You'll want to know why, soon enough." He said nothing, but he did. The team pulled steady against the frost-hardened ruts, and the ranch house came up slow on the horizon, gray smoke already bent sideways by wind that had teeth in it now. He did not speak again until the barn was in sight, and then only to say, "There's a stove. And a bed that isn't this wagon." She did not answer that either, only shifted the tin box into the crook of her arm, like something that might be taken from her if she loosened her grip, and he understood, without being told, that this was a woman who had learned to hold on to things. He noticed the boots first. Cracked through at the toe, one sole separating from its upper, in a way that meant miles, not days. He noticed the coat next, too thin for October, thinner still for what November would bring, and the way she'd folded her arms not for warmth but to make herself smaller, a woman practiced in taking up less room than she was owed. At the yard he set the brake and came around to hand her down, and she refused the hand without unkindness, climbing down on her own with a care that told him her feet hurt worse than her pride would admit. She stood in the yard a moment, looking at the house, the barn, the lean-to smoke rising off past the north fence where the old man kept himself, and something in her face went still and calculating, the look of a woman doing sums she didn't want to do. "I can pay for the meal," she said, "once I've work. Nobody's asking you to pay for anything." "Everybody asks eventually," she said it plain, without bitterness, the way a person states weather. He didn't argue the point, because he suspected she was right, and because arguing would have meant explaining himself, and explaining himself was a country he'd stopped visiting 11 winters back. Instead, he took the grain sacks off the wagon bed 2 at a time, working the ache out of his shoulders, and did not look at her while he worked, which was its own kind of courtesy. The hired hand came out from the barn wiping his hands on his trousers, took one look at her, and opened his mouth to say something the rancher already knew he'd regret. The rancher set down a sack hard enough that the boy shut his mouth on his own. "Get the small room ready," the rancher said. "Fire lit." The boy went, casting one more look back that the rancher chose not to catch. She stood in the yard, still tin box against her ribs, watching the smoke from the lean-to, as if she already sensed there was somebody living out there who would matter to her story, before the winter was through, though neither of them yet knew how much. The small room turned out to be off the kitchen, a lean space with a cot and a window facing east, and the boy had the fire going by the time the rancher walked her to the door. She stopped on the threshold the way a person stops at the edge of water they don't trust the depth of, and he understood without being told that she was counting the cost of the room before she'd let herself enter it, whether there'd be work demanded in exchange, whether the door would lock from the outside, whether kindness here came with a ledger like it apparently had everywhere else she'd been. "Ain't nothing you owe for it tonight," he said, and left her to decide. She set the tin box on the small table by the cot before she did anything else. He saw that, though he pretended he hadn't, going back out to finish with the wagon. A woman does not put a thing down first unless it is the one thing she trusts more than her own 2 hands. By the second morning she was up before he was, which he discovered only because he came into the kitchen expecting cold ash, and found instead a fire built correctly, banked the way his mother used to bank one, and a pot of cornmeal mush already thickening on the stove, though nobody had asked her to cook a thing. She did not announce herself. She was simply there, sleeves pushed to the elbow, moving around his kitchen like she'd been given a map of it in a dream. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know what I have to," she said, not looking up. "This ain't that." He ate what she made and did not tell her it was better than anything he'd cooked for himself in 11 years, though it was, and though the boy ate 2 helpings and said nothing smart for once, which the rancher counted as its own small miracle. It was the 3rd day the old man from the lean-to came up to the house, moving slow on a hip that had been bad since before the rancher was grown, drawn by the smell of coffee, or by some older instinct that had nothing to do with smell at all. He stood in the kitchen doorway a long moment, looking at her the way a man looks at handwriting he half recognizes. "Where'd you learn to salt a ham hock like that?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "Split Creek," she said. "Saloon kitchen. 8 years." Something crossed the old man's face then, recognition, or the shadow of it, and he didn't say what he was thinking, only nodded once and took the coffee she poured him with both hands, like it was owed to him from somewhere further back than that morning. The rancher watched the two of them and understood, without yet knowing why, that he had just watched something get decided, that he hadn't been consulted on, and that it would matter before the snow came. The old man came back the next morning before the frost had burned off the grass, and the morning after that, until it was simply understood that he would come, the way weather was understood. He brought nothing, and asked for nothing except the coffee, which he drank black and slow, watching her hands more than her face. On the fourth morning he set a folded square of paper on the table without a word. It was a page torn from somewhere, soft at the creases from handling, and on it was written a recipe for sourdough starter in a hand that had clearly cramped with age even as it wrote. "My wife's," he said. "She's been gone 6 years. Nobody's made it right since." She looked at the paper a long moment before she touched it, and the rancher, standing by the stove pretending to check the damper, saw something pass over her face that she did not let reach her mouth. She read it twice. Then she went to the shelf where she kept her tin box. She had taken to keeping it in the kitchen now, though still closed, still private, and she did not open it, only rested her hand flat on the lid, as if asking permission of something inside it. "I can try," she said. She tried that same afternoon, and failed, the starter going flat and sour in a way that told her the flour was wrong or the water too cold, and she said so plainly, without apology, the way she said most things. The old man laughed for the first time since the rancher had known him, a short bark of a sound rusted from disuse. "That's exactly what she used to say," he said, "word for word. The water's wrong, not me." He did not explain what he meant by that, and the rancher did not ask, though he turned it over that night lying awake listening to the wind test the shutters, the way he turned over most things she said or didn't say. He had begun to notice that she carried herself like a woman who had buried more than one grief and learned which ones could be spoken of at a stove and which could not. He had begun to notice, too, that the old man's visits had a rhythm now, a claim staked without words, that whatever recognition had crossed his face that first morning over the ham hock had deepened into something the rancher didn't yet have the shape of. He asked the hired hand about it, offhand, mucking out the stalls. The boy shrugged. Old-timers get attached to anything that feeds them regular. But the rancher had seen the old man's hands shake when he set down that paper, and he did not think it was hunger driving it. He decided he would ask her himself, plainly, the way she seemed to prefer things asked. He chose a evening when the dishes were done, and the child not yet born enough to make her tired past speaking, and he was still working out how to begin, when she set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat down across from him first. She wrapped both hands around her cup and did not drink from it. The steam rose between them, and for a moment she watched it, the way a person watches something they have decided to trust before they have decided to speak. "You want to know about Wallace," she said. It was not a question, so he did not answer it as one. He waited. "He drove cattle with your father," she said. 14 years, on and off, before your father took the wife and settled here. Wallace tells it different every time, depending on how much his knees hurt that day. But the year is always the same. 61. She turned the cup a quarter turn on the table, as if aligning it to something only she could see. "My mother cooked for that outfit. Not the whole drive, just the one season, out of Ogallala. She was younger than I am now." The rancher set his own cup down slow enough that it made no sound. "Wallace knew her," he said. "Wallace ate her cooking for 4 months and never forgot it," she said. And there was something in her mouth that was almost a smile, though it did not stay. "He told me the second week he was here. Said the biscuits gave it away before my face did. Said no one taught a woman to work lard into flour like that except one woman he ever knew, and she'd been dead near 20 years, and he'd have sworn to it in a courtroom." The wind moved against the house in a long, low push, and somewhere out past the barn a cow lowed once and went quiet. "You never said," the rancher said, not an accusation, just the shape of the fact laid flat between them. "There wasn't a place in the saying that fit," she said. "Not at the wagon. Not froze half to death in your barn. What was I going to do? Tell a stranger who my mother was while I was stealing his grain sacks for a bed?" She looked at him then, direct, the way she rarely allowed herself to look at anyone in that house. "I've spent most of a year learning what to tell and when. That's not a lie. That's just economy." He turned that word over. It fit her, he thought. Economy. Nothing wasted, not words, not lard, not grief. "Wallace been keeping that to himself since October," he said. "Wallace has been keeping a lot of things to himself since October," she said. "He's old. He likes to choose his own moment." She finally drank from the cup, and when she set it down, her voice had gone quieter, less like a woman answering a question, and more like one setting something down she'd carried a long way. "He said he'd tell you himself when the time was right. I expect that's not too far off now." The rancher did not press her further that night, but he lay awake past the point of tiredness, turning over the shape of a woman he'd found half frozen among grain sacks who had, without his knowing it, already been half known to his own father's outfit, 16 years before either of them had been born into whatever this was becoming. Morning came hard and white with frost, the kind that laid a crust over the water trough thick enough to need the axe head to break. He went to Wallace's lean-to before the sun cleared the ridge, boots crunching, breath smoking ahead of him like something trying to get there first. The old man was awake. He was always awake before anyone expected him to be, sitting on his cot with a blanket over his knees, and his hands wrapped around a tin cup, gone cold an hour before. "You've been sitting on something," the rancher said. No greeting. Wallace didn't need one. "Sit," Wallace said. He sat. The lean-to smelled of wood smoke and liniment, and something older, leather gone soft with age. Wallace looked at him a long moment, the way a man looks at a fence line, before deciding whether it'll hold the weight he means to put on it. "Your daddy ran cattle down through the Sweetwater in '61, Wallace said. "Before the war took the good men off and left the rest of us. There was an outfit out of Split Creek then, small, ran by a fellow named Corliss, had a cook." "Her mother," the rancher said. It wasn't a question. "Her mother," Wallace agreed. "Best trail cook I ever ate behind, and I ate behind plenty. Woman could take a side of salt pork gone half to rind and make men cry over it. Your daddy used to trade extra rounds of ammunition just to get seconds. He drank from the cold cup like it still had something in it worth drinking." She kept a tin box, recipes, wrote them down at night by firelight, because she didn't trust her own memory, she said, not with 11 children's worth of winters behind her, and more ahead. The rancher felt something settle into place, slow, like a wagon wheel finding a rut it had traveled before. "The box she carries now." The very one. Wallace's eyes had gone somewhere else, some plane long since grown over. Her mother died the winter of '64. Coughed herself thin. "I helped bury her myself, out past the North Crossing. No marker but a cairn of riverstone." He looked up. Girl was near grown by then. Learned every one of those cards by heart before she ever needed to read the box to know what was in it. The rancher sat with that, the frost outside ticking faintly as it thinned in the first sun. 11 cards. 11 children's winters. A woman who had cooked for his father's outfit before either of them had breath in their lungs, and a daughter who had carried that same tin through a saloon fire, out into an October night, into his own wagon bed. "Why now?" he said. "Why tell me this morning and not some other?" Wallace's mouth moved like it wanted to smile and thought better of it. "Because you'll want to know the rest before the ground thaws," he said. "And there's more of it than you think." The old man did not say more just then. He rose instead, joints cracking like green wood, and went to the lean-to's single shelf, where a tin box of his own sat behind a coffee can gone black with use. He set it on the table between them without ceremony, the way a man sets down something he has carried too long to feel its weight anymore. "Your father knew her mother," he said, "not the way men know women in town talk, Knew her the way you know a good horse, trusted her at her word, paid her fair, never asked more than the work called for. He opened the tin. Inside were not recipes but papers, folded soft at the creases, ink gone the color of weak tea. She cooked the drive of 61, fed 40 men on beans and salt pork, and made it taste like something a man remembered his mother making. Your father wrote her a letter of account when the season ended. Wages paid in full, and something more besides. He slid one paper across. The rancher did not touch it at first. "Read it," Wallace said. "It concerns the girl, same as the mother." The hand was his father's. He knew it before the words resolved, the particular slant of the capital letters, the ink pressed hard on downstrokes, the way a man presses who learned his letters late and never trusted them. Paid in full, and $10 besides, for the girl's schooling, should she want it, so she is never made a servant of her hunger. The rancher set the paper down as though it had grown suddenly heavier. "He never told me this. Man like your father didn't tell things. He did them, and let the doing stand." Wallace took the paper back, folded it along its old creases, with the care of a man handling something alive. $10.61 was near a month's wage. He gave it to the mother before she ever asked, and she never spent it, kept it against the day the girl might need it more. That's the kind of family she comes from, not saloon leavings, not charity cases. He looked at the rancher steadily. "Your father would have known her the moment he saw that tin box. You didn't. That's not a fault in you. It's a thing you're only now catching up to." Outside, the last frost was breaking off the eaves in small wet clicks, one by one, like a clock running down toward something the rancher could not yet name. He thought of her at the stove that morning, humming low over the skillet, unaware that 2 men in a lean-to were unearthing the ground beneath her feet. "There's more," Wallace said again, quieter now, "but you'll want to sit a while longer before I give you the rest of it." The rancher sat. The stool beneath him creaked, the way old wood does when it has borne enough weight, from enough men, over enough winters, that it no longer bothers to complain in earnest, only to remind you it remembers. Wallace reached into the tin box beside his cot, the one that was not hers, an older thing, army surplus, dented along one seam where a mule had once kicked it down a ravine in 58. He drew out a second paper, this one not folded but rolled, tied with a strip of rawhide gone stiff with age. "Your father wasn't the only one who knew her people," he said. "There was a debt the other direction, too, owed to him." He untied the rawhide slowly, the way a man handles a knot he tied himself decades ago and has since forgotten the shape of. Her father, not the drifter, the real one, the one who raised her before the fever took him, rode with your father 2 seasons on the Bozeman Trail. Ought to tell you what kind of man that was. Nobody rode 2 full seasons under Cassius Hale unless they could be trusted with a herd, a gun, and a secret, all 3, all at once. The rancher's jaw tightened at his father's name spoken plain like that, unadorned, the way only men who'd shared a fire with him ever said it. "There was a night near the Platte Crossing," Wallace went on. "Cattle spooked. Lost 11 head into the current before dawn. Man could have been blamed for it. Put off the drive without pay. $40 lost wage right there. Your father took the blame instead. Told the trail boss it was his watch, not the other man's. Never told a soul otherwise. Man never forgot it. Named his girl for your mother, matter of fact. You'll notice that, once you know to look." The rancher's hands had gone still on his knees. "Grace," Wallace said, watching him absorb it. "Same as your mother's Christian name. Her father meant it as a debt, repaid in the only currency he had. A name is a poor thing to spend on a debt, but it's what a poor man has." Outside, a magpie complained somewhere in the bare cottonwoods, and the sound carried thin and hard across the yard. "So you see," Wallace said, rolling the rawhide back into its old crease, "this isn't 2 families crossing paths by accident in a wagon on the Split Creek Road. This is a debt that's been waiting 11 years for somebody to notice it was still open." He set the paper down between them like a hand of cards laid face up. "Your father would call that a circle closing. I don't know what you'd call it, but I'd wager you already feel it, same as I do, sitting in this room." The rancher did not answer right away. He looked at the paper on the table, the ink gone brown as dried blood, and he thought of the woman asleep now in the room down the hall, her hand curled around the edge of the quilt, the way a person holds on to something even in sleep. He thought of the tin box on her shelf, 11 cards in a dead woman's hand, and how a name could travel further than a wagon ever would. "I'd call it a debt," he said finally. "Same as you." Wallace nodded, satisfied, as though the rancher had passed some small test he hadn't known he was taking. He folded the rawhide strip back into its pouch with the care of a man handling something that had outlived its usefulness and its owner both, and set it on the table between them, not offering it, not withholding it either. "Her father never spoke his name again after the war," Wallace said. "Not to anyone. But he told me once, drunk on bad whiskey in a line camp outside Cheyenne, that he'd have died in that river if your father hadn't gone in after him. Ice water in March. Your father pulled him out by the collar of his coat and near froze his own hands doing it." He tapped the table. "That scar on your left hand, you ever ask him where the first one came from, before the roping accident took the rest of it?" The rancher's jaw tightened. He had a scar there, an old one, faded pale and thin along the base of his thumb, one he'd always taken for a boyhood accident with a hay hook. He had never once asked. "He never told me anything," the rancher said. "Man wasn't much for talking, my father." "No," Wallace agreed. "Neither are you, from what I've seen. Runs in families, same as the rest of it does." He pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the plank floor, and reached for his coat where it hung on the peg by the door. "I'm an old man, and my chest doesn't like this cold anymore. I'll leave the paper with you. Do with it what you think is right. Read it to her, or don't. That's yours to decide, not mine." He paused at the door, one hand on the frame, and looked back at the rancher with the particular patience of a man who had buried most of what he'd loved, and learned to say the important things plainly, since there was no longer time to say them any other way. "But I'll tell you this," he said. "A woman finds out the family that fed her, sheltered her, gave her a wagon to hide in. That same family owed her father his life, 11 years before she was ever born. That's not a small thing to carry alone." He opened the door to the thin gray light. "You'll want to think on how you tell her, because you will have to tell her." The door shut behind the old man, and the cold he'd let in settled over the room like a second visitor that refused to leave. The rancher stood a long moment with his hand still on the back of the empty chair, listening to the crunch of boots retreating toward the lean-to, and then he looked down at the paper on the table. It was 2 pages, folded once, the old man's handwriting cramped and slanting the way a man's writing goes when his fingers have taken more winters than they can properly hold a pen through anymore. The rancher did not sit back down to read it. He carried it instead to the window, where the light was better, and he read it standing, the way a man reads something he suspects he will need to read twice. The first page told of a cattle drive, 11 years gone, up from Texas, through country that had killed better men than the ones who survived it. It told of a fever that had come through the camp in October and taken 4 hands before it was done, and of one man, her father, the paper said plainly, naming him, who had lain 3 days in a wagon bed, not unlike the one the rancher himself still hauled feed in, too weak to lift a cup to his own mouth. It told of another man who had sat with him those 3 nights, who had fed him broth spoon by spoon when no one else would spare the time, because time on a drive was cattle and money and nothing else, and a dying man was already counted as lost. That other man's name was the rancher's father's name. The second page was shorter. It said only that the debt of that kindness had never been repaid, because the drive had scattered the men to 4 territories before it could be, and because the old cook had carried the knowing of it alone for 11 years, never certain it would matter to anyone again, until a woman had turned up half-frozen in a wagon on this same land, and he had recognized in her face, before he could have said why, something of a man he'd watched die slow and gentle in another October, under another canvas. The rancher set the paper down on the table. He looked at it for a while without touching it again, and then he looked out the window toward the barn, where he could hear her singing low to herself over the wash basin, unaware that the ground she stood on had been paying a debt to her family longer than she had been alive to know it. He did not know yet how a man was supposed to say such a thing to a woman. He only knew that he would have to find the words before the thaw came, because some things could not wait for spring the way the calving could. He found her at the wash basin an hour later, her sleeves pushed to the elbow, steam rising off the water into the cold air of the lean-to shed. She did not stop scrubbing when he came in. She had learned, these past weeks, that he was a man who took his time getting to what he meant to say, and that hurrying him only made the silence longer. He set a second chair by the stove and did not sit in it. He told her, plain, about the old cook, about the drive 11 years back, about a hand near frozen through, and a father who had given up his own coat rather than watch a boy lose the fingers. He told her the boy's name, her father's name, the way a man reads out a ledger entry, careful not to weight it more than the facts allowed. She stopped scrubbing. Her hands stayed in the water, gone still, and for a moment, the only sound was the stove ticking as it cooled. Then she asked him to say it again, the part about the coat, and he did, word for word as near as he could remember it, and watched something move behind her eyes that had nothing to do with him at all, a reaching backward, 30 years and more, toward a man she had never known enough to grieve properly, because grief needs particulars, and she had never before this hour been given any. She wiped her hands on her apron. She said her mother used to speak of her father's kindness as if it were a coat too big for the house they'd lived in, something admired, never quite explained. She had thought it only her mother's way of missing him. Now she understood her mother had been telling the truth the plainest way she knew, and no one had believed the size of it until a dying man on a Wyoming ranch had written it down for a stranger to find. The rancher did not know what a woman wanted done with news like that. He had thought, riding home with the letter folded in his coat, that he would explain the debt and be done with the telling. He had not accounted for how a person could sit with an old sorrow and a new one arriving in the same breath, and how there was no fixing that with paper. She asked, after a while, whether the old cook still had kin of his own, out east or elsewhere. The rancher said he did not know. She said then that someone ought to ask him, before the ground froze any harder, because a man who carried another man's debt for 11 years deserved to be asked what debts of his own were left unpaid. The rancher agreed that this was so. He did not say what else had settled in him standing there, that he had come in meaning to tell her about her father, and found himself instead watching the way she held herself upright under news heavy enough to fell most people, and thinking that the ranch had never once, in 11 years, felt this occupied. The rancher went to the lean-to the next morning, before the frost had lifted off the fence rails, carrying a plate of biscuits she had wrapped in cloth and pressed into his hands without a word. The old cook was awake, as he always was, sitting by a stove that gave off more smoke than heat, mending a boot sole with a bone needle that had likely mended 100 boots before it. The rancher asked him plain, did he have people, sons, daughters, a sister somewhere who might wonder, come spring, whether he was living or dead? The old man did not answer at once. He set the boot down and looked at the stove door, as though something might walk out of it. Then he said there had been a daughter, once, born in a soddy in Nebraska in the year of the big snow, and that her mother had died of the same fever that had taken half that county, and that he had left the girl with his wife's sister because a trail cook had no business raising an infant on a chuck wagon between Ogallala and Dodge. He said he had meant to go back for her. He said this the way a man says a thing he has said to himself so many times it has worn smooth, no longer sharp enough to cut. The rancher asked her name. The old man said it, and then said he did not know if she answered to it still, or to a married name, or whether she was living at all, because the aunt had moved twice that he knew of, and once more that he had only heard of, and after that the trail had gone, the way trails go when a man is too proud to write, and too poor to travel. The rancher rode back to the house with the cold working into his coat, and found her at the table, the tin box open before her, sorting the 11 cards the way she did most evenings now, not for any recipe she meant to cook, but for the plain fact of having them in her hands. He told her what the old man had said. She listened without stopping her sorting, and when he had finished, she was quiet a long moment, And then she said that a man could carry a debt of guilt as easy as a debt of money, and sometimes easier, because no one ever came around demanding payment on the first kind, which was its own cruelty. She asked if the rancher knew anyone in Nebraska. He said he did not, but that Split Creek had a telegraph line now, strung up that summer, and a man could send a message to a county courthouse asking after a name, if a man knew what he was doing, which he did not, but the Reverend's wife did, having done it once for her own people. She closed the tin box. She said then that they ought to try before the old man ran out of winters left to wait in. The ride to Split Creek took the better part of a morning, the wagon wheels cutting fresh lines through frost that had not yet burned off the ruts. She rode beside him this time, the tin box left behind on the shelf, and he noticed she kept glancing back toward the ranch as though she had left something more than a box there. The Reverend's wife received them in a parlor smelling of beeswax and old paper, and she wrote the message twice before she was satisfied with it, spare, plain, addressed to the clerk of a county courthouse in a town called Ogallala, asking after any record of a man's people, a wife or children, under the name the old trail cook had given years ago and rarely spoken since. It was the Reverend's wife who asked, without looking up from her pen, whether they knew what they were asking after. She said the old man had told her husband once, long before, in the particular hour men confess things they mean never to repeat, that he had left a wife and a daughter in Nebraska in the spring of '61, walked off toward the cattle trails with the war coming, and never walked back. He had told himself at first it was a season's absence. Seasons became years. Years became a life spent on the far side of a decision he had stopped examining, because examining it cost more than a man his age could pay. The rancher said nothing to this. He had known the old man 11 years and had never heard him say more of his past than a handful of trail names and one dead partner's memory. He found himself turning the fact over the way he turned a green colt's hoof, looking for the crack that explained the limp. She asked the Reverend's wife whether a daughter, now, would be a grown woman. The Reverend's wife said she would be older than the rancher himself, likely, if she still lived, old enough to have children of her own who had never heard the name of the grandfather who left them. The message went out on the wire that afternoon, tapped away by the operator in a code neither of them could follow, carrying the old man's guilt eastward, faster than a horse could run it, faster than the old man himself had ever managed to outrun it walking. They rode home in the last hour of daylight, the sky gone the color of a healing bruise, and she said, watching the fence posts pass, that it was a strange thing to spend a life carrying weight nobody had asked you to carry, and stranger still that the asking, when it finally came from strangers, a wire message away, instead of the only mouth that had ever mattered. The rancher did not answer. He was thinking of the old man's lean-to, the low fire, the quiet, and wondering what answer might come back down that wire, and whether the old man had winters enough left to hear it. The answer came 11 days later, not by wire, but by letter, which the operator said was the more serious kind of correspondence, the kind a person paid extra postage for, the kind meant to arrive whole and unhurried rather than chopped into code. The rancher rode into Split Creek alone to fetch it, leaving her at the ranch with the hired hand and the stove, and he read it standing at the counter because the postmaster was watching and he did not trust himself to wait. The old man's daughter was alive. She lived in a town in Ohio he had never heard of, married to a man who ran a dry goods store, with 3 children of her own, the youngest a boy of 9. She had not known her father was living until the wire came. She wrote that her mother had died believing him dead in a river crossing in '51, and that she herself had believed the same, and that she did not know yet what she felt about a man who had let her believe it for 26 years, rather than write one letter in all that time. She wrote that she was not ready to travel, not with the winter coming on and the children in school, but that she wanted the truth of him, whether he was dying, whether he was sorry, whether there was anything in him worth a daughter's forgiveness, or whether she was chasing a ghost's apology out of habit rather than hope. The rancher rode back with the letter folded twice in his coat, and did not read it aloud until the old man was sitting up in the low firelight with the blanket over his knees, and even then, he read it slow. the way a man reads scripture he is not certain he believes, but respects enough not to rush. The old man did not weep. He sat with his hands folded and his eyes on the fire, and said only that it was more than he had earned, and that a man ought not to ask for more than he had earned, and that he supposed he would write back and tell her the truth of it, whatever the truth turned out to be, once he sat down to find it. She stood in the doorway with the tin box under her arm. She had brought biscuits, an excuse to be present, and she said that the truth, in her experience, was usually shorter and plainer than the guilt built up around it, and that most people did not need forgiveness so much as they needed someone to finally say the thing out loud. The old man looked at her a long moment, the fire cracking between them, and asked her to fetch him paper and a pen, because there was no sense waiting on strength he was not certain he'd keep. She fetched the paper from the tin box on the shelf where the rancher kept what few letters came to the ranch, and a stub of pencil worn down to the wood on one side, and she brought both back to the lean-to and set them in the old man's lap without comment, because she had learned by then that a man writing a hard letter did not want to be watched doing it. He wrote for the better part of an hour. The fire burned low, and she fed it twice without being asked, and the hired hand came to the door once with a question about the north fence, and left again without his question when he saw the old man's face bent over the paper, pencil moving in small, careful strokes, the strokes of a man who had not written much in his life, and meant every one of these to count. When he finished, he did not read it aloud. He folded it once, then again, and held it out to her instead of sealing it himself, and said that his hand shook too much anymore to trust the wax, and would she do him the kindness. She sealed it at the table by lamplight, dripping the wax slow so it would not run, and she noticed her own hands were steadier than his had been, and she thought that this was one more thing nobody had ever told her she was good for, steadiness. And one more thing she had never once doubted in herself, even when the whole town had doubted everything else. The rancher came in from the barn near dark, stamping frost off his boots, and found them both still at the table, the letter sitting sealed and addressed between them like a third person in the room. He did not ask what it said. He had learned that too, this past month, that some things a man earns the right to know by waiting rather than asking. It was the old man who told him anyway, plain and unhurried, the way he told most things now that he had decided speech cost him less than he'd feared. He said he had written to the daughter and told her the truth of the money and the years both, and that he did not know what would come of it, only that he had rather die having said it than die having spared himself the saying. The rancher looked at the letter a long moment. Then he said he would carry it to Split Creek himself in the morning, save the old man the ride, and the old man nodded like a man setting down a sack he'd carried too far, and said that would suit him fine, and asked if there was coffee left, because a letter like that left a man thirsty in a way water didn't reach. She poured it for him without being asked. Outside, the wind had picked up, working at the eaves the way it did before snow, and none of them said so, but all three of them heard it, and knew what it meant for the roads come morning. The wind kept its promise by dawn. Snow came thin and sideways, not enough yet to close the road, but enough to whiten the wagon ruts and put a hush over the yard that felt, to him, like the held breath before a decision. He saddled the gelding instead of hitching the team, judging a single rider could beat the weather where a loaded wagon could not. She stood in the doorway with the letter already sealed in his coat pocket, and she did not ask him to stay, though he saw the wanting of it cross her face, and then get put away, the same way she put away most things that cost her more than she could afford to show. 2 days, he said. 3 if it turns. I know how to count days, she said, and the dryness of it eased something in his chest, because a woman still able to be dry with him was a woman not yet afraid of what the letter might cost. The old man did not come out to see him off. He had said his piece the night before, and seemed, this morning, like a man resting after work rather than a man waiting on its result. Through the lean-to window, the rancher saw him sitting with his hands folded on the table, not sleeping, only still, and something in that stillness stayed with the rancher the whole first hour of riding, though he could not yet have said why. The road to Split Creek was harder than the trip that carried grain, and easier than the trip that had once carried her. He thought of that more than once. The difference between hauling stores and hauling a woman half frozen under canvas, and how the same ruts in the road did not feel the same twice. By midday, the snow thinned to a scatter, and the sun came weak and sideways through cloud, and he stopped once to let the gelding blow and to eat cold biscuits standing up, the letter a stiff square against his ribs the whole while, as if it had weight beyond paper. He reached the edge of town by dusk of the second day, later than he'd hoped. The windows of Split Creek lit yellow one by one against the coming dark. He did not go to the saloon. He went instead to the small frame house behind the dry goods store where the daughter was said to board, and he stood a moment on the step before he knocked, turning over in his mind all the ways a woman might receive news of a father's debt and a father's years, both delivered by a stranger's hand. The door opened on a woman perhaps 30, thin-faced, wary in the particular way of someone long practiced in bad news, arriving unannounced. "I've brought a letter," he said, "from your father." Her eyes went first to his face, then to the shape in his coat, and something in her stood very still, the way people do when they already suspect what a letter like that must mean, and are only waiting to be told they're right. She did not invite him in right away. She stood with her hand on the frame, reading his face as if the letter itself might be read there first, and only after a long moment did she step back and let him pass into a kitchen smelling of lamp oil and boiled coffee. He gave her the letter. He did not speak while she opened it, did not offer comfort he had no right to offer, only stood with his hat in his hands, the way his mother had taught him. A man stands in another person's grief. She read slowly. Her mouth moved once, silently, over some line near the middle, and her eyes filled but did not spill, and when she finished, she set the paper flat on the table and smoothed it with her palm, as if to keep the words from lifting off the page and leaving her again. "He never wrote me in 11 years, she said. "Not once. He wrote you this, after he was dying. Some men only find the words when there's nothing left to spend them on." She looked at him then, with something sharper than grief. "You knew him?" "Little enough to see he wasn't a man who wasted breath saying what he didn't mean." She read the letter twice more before she folded it, and in the second reading, her face changed, softened at the edges, the way frost softens toward noon. She asked him to sit. She poured coffee neither of them wanted, and asked careful questions, how the old man had looked at the end, whether he'd suffered, whether he'd spoken of her before the fever took the clarity from his mind. And he answered plainly, without embellishment, because plain truth seemed the only decent currency between them. Near the end, she asked about the woman he'd written of in the letter's last lines, the one with the tin box, the one who'd fed him in his last winter, and he told her, briefly, the shape of it, the wagon, the winter, the child soon to come. She listened with her hands folded, and something crossed her face he could not name. Not envy, not quite grief, something closer to relief that her father's dying months had not been solitary after all. "He said she cooked the way my mother used to," she said quietly, "before she passed. He said the same to me." She was silent a moment, turning the folded letter over once in her hands. "Tell her," she said finally, "that I don't grudge her the years I lost. Tell her I'm glad someone was kind to him when I wasn't there to be." He rode out from Split Creek before full dark, the letter's answer tucked now inside his coat, the town's lamps falling behind him one by one into the cold. The ride back took 2 days, and the cold had teeth in it now, the kind that found the seams of a coat and worked its way through by patience alone. He stopped once at a line shack to water the horse and warm his hands over a fire built from what dry brush he could find, and it was there, in that small enclosed silence, that he read the daughter's answer again by firelight, though he had already memorized its shape. He thought of how to say it. A woman glad someone was kind to her father, that was not a sentence a man carried easily across 100 miles of frozen ground. He practiced no words. He had learned, across the winter, that she preferred the plain fact to the rehearsed one, and so he decided he would simply hand her the letter when the time came, and let her read the daughter's hand for herself. When the ranch house came into view on the second evening, smoke rising thin and steady from the chimney, he felt something in his chest loosen that he had not known was tight. The lean-to stood empty and dark against the barn wall, its door still lashed shut against weather nobody needed to keep out anymore, and he did not look at it long. She was at the stove when he came in, her back to the door, the tin box open on the shelf beside her, one card propped against the wall where she could read it while she worked. She turned at the sound of the latch, and whatever she saw in his face made her set down the spoon. "You found her," she said. "I did." He gave her the letter without preamble, the way he'd decided he would, and stood by the door with his hat still in his hand while she read it, her lips moving faintly over certain words, the way they did when something mattered to her. When she reached the last lines, her eyes stayed there a long moment, unmoving, and he saw her throat work once, twice, before she folded the paper along its old creases and pressed it flat against her palm. "She's not angry," she said, as though she needed to say it aloud to believe it. "No." "Good." She set the letter on the shelf beside the tin box, not inside it, separate, its own small thing now. "Good," she said again, quieter, and turned back to the stove, and he understood that this was as much relief as she meant to show him, and that it was enough. The stew thickened while she stirred it, and he stood a while longer than he needed to, watching the small domestic machinery of the kitchen resume around him, the wooden spoon against the pot's iron rim, the way she braced her weight against the counter to ease the ache that had settled permanently into her lower back these past weeks. The baby had begun to press downward, low and hard, and she'd taken to standing when she could rather than sitting, though she never said why. He had learned to read it anyway. That was the thing about a winter spent under one roof. A man learned to read a woman the way he read weather, by small signs accumulated, rather than by anything she told him outright. He hung his coat on the peg by the door and did not leave, and she did not ask him to. "The trail cook's letter," he said. He wrote it 3 weeks before he took sick. He had thought about this on the ride back, turning it over the way he turned over a stone, looking for what crawled underneath. He knew he was going. He wrote it anyway. He knew a lot of things before anybody else did. She did not turn from the stove. "He knew about me before I told him. He knew about you before you knew about yourself." He let that sit. Outside, the wind had picked up again, working at the eaves with the low, persistent sound it made most nights that time of year. And somewhere past the barn, a cow lowed once, twice, and went quiet. The hired hand's boots crossed the yard toward the bunkhouse, unhurried, a man settling in for the night, the way he'd learned to since autumn. No rush now. The work of the day folded up and put away. "Council's meeting Tuesday," he said, "about the debt." She set the spoon down against the pot's rim, careful, deliberate, the way she did everything with her hands. "I know. You'll come." It was not quite a question, and she seemed to understand that, because she did not answer it as one. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him, a long look, weighing something, the kind of look she'd given him back in October when he'd first pulled the canvas back and found her there among the grain sacks, though there was nothing frightened in it now. "I'll come," she said. "It's my name they're saying." He nodded and reached for his hat, and neither of them said what both of them were thinking, that a name, once spoken loud enough in a room full of men who believed themselves entitled to judge it, had a way of costing more than any debt on paper. Tuesday came with a hard blue sky and no wind at all, which somehow made the cold worse, a stillness that let it settle into a man's bones, instead of blowing past them. He hitched the wagon before light. She came out in her good dress, the one she'd made over from a bolt of gray wool bought with her own wages, and she carried the tin recipe box under her arm, the way another woman might carry a Bible. "You don't need that," he said. "I know what I need," she said, and that was the end of it. The trail cook's letter rode folded in the rancher's coat pocket, the ink gone a little brown with age even though it was fresh, because the old man's hand had shaken so badly writing it that he'd had to go over some of the words twice. He had died 3 days before finishing it. The hired hand had found him in the lean-to, still holding the pen. They did not speak much on the ride. The ruts were frozen hard, and the wagon jumped over them, and she braced herself against the seat rail with one gloved hand, the other resting flat over the curve of her belly, low now, heavy. 4 months from the day he'd found her grown into something that filled the whole wagon bed with its presence, though she herself moved slower these days, careful on the steps, careful everywhere. Split Creek came up out of the flat land the way it always did, smoke first, then the shape of roofs, then the church spire that had nothing to do with anything that was about to happen inside the Mercantile's back room where the council met. "They'll want to shame you," he said finally, eyes on the road. "That's what a room like that is for." "They already did that," she said. "Once. It doesn't work twice." He looked at her then, a long look of his own, and something in his chest that had been coiled tight since October, since the smell of her fear that first morning, since the way she'd flinched at a raised voice for weeks after, loosened by some small measure, because she'd said it plain and true and without needing him to agree. The hired hand was waiting at the edge of town on his own horse, hat pulled low, a folded paper of his own inside his coat. "Cook's letter get here safe?" he asked. "Safe," the rancher said. "Good," the boy said, and fell in beside the wagon, and the three of them went on into Split Creek together, past the saloon, with its shuttered windows, toward the Mercantile where the men who thought they owned her name were already gathering to decide what it was worth. The Mercantile's back room smelled of coffee gone bitter and lamp oil, and the particular staleness of men who had been arguing before anyone else arrived. 6 of them sat at a long table scarred with tally marks from 40 years of grain sales. The saloon owner sat at the head of it, coat brushed clean, hands folded like a man at prayer, though there was nothing of prayer in his face. She stood just inside the doorway. She did not sit when a chair was offered, and the rancher understood why. Sitting meant waiting to be judged, and she had done enough of that in her life. The council clerk read the figure aloud first, as though numbers alone could settle it. $46, owed for board and lodging in the months before her dismissal, a debt the saloon owner swore she had never paid. He said the word, dismissal, carefully, the way a man handles a tool he doesn't want blood on. "She worked 11 months in your kitchen," the rancher said. His voice did not rise. It never needed to. "Fed 40 men a night on rations for 20. You paid her $4 a month and called it fair." "That's not the matter before this council," the saloon owner said. "It's the only matter," the rancher answered. The trail cook's letter went onto the table next, unfolded by the clerk's own hand. The old man's crabbed writing plain, even from where she stood. An account of her competence, her honesty, the winter she'd survived on the rancher's land, doing work no soft-handed man in that room could have managed. The hired hand's testimony followed it, plain-spoken, unpolished, the boy's ears red as he read his own words back to men twice his age. He did not stammer. That surprised her more than anything else that morning. The saloon owner's mouth worked, searching for a foothold, and finding the table too smooth to grip. "The debt is fabricated," the rancher said, "and you know it is, same as every man in this room knows it." He set down 4 gold coins and change from his coat, counted out slow enough that no one could mistake the sum. $46, laid flat on the wood beside the letter and the boy's testimony. "There," he said, "paid, owed to no one now." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when a thing has been settled, that everyone privately wished had been settled months ago, and did not have the courage to do themselves. She did not smile. She only breathed, once, deep, the way a person breathes when a weight long carried has finally been set down, and reached for the tin box she had brought with her, though no one in that room had asked to see it. She set the tin box on the table, not for the room, but because her hands needed something to hold that was not the coins and was not the letter. The lid stuck the way it always stuck, swollen at one corner from some spilled broth years back, and she worked it loose with the same patience she gave to everything that resisted her. 11 cards inside. She did not take them out. She only let the lid stand open long enough that the saloon owner, still red-faced and searching the room for an ally he would not find, saw what it was: a dead woman's handwriting, a daughter's inheritance, worth nothing to him and everything to her, and something in his expression flattened out, not shame exactly, but the recognition of a thing he could not touch, and had never been able to touch, not with wages, not with rumor, not with the weight of a town's good opinion. The councilman cleared his throat and said the matter was closed, and asked if there was anything further, in the tone of a man hoping there was not. There was not. The saloon owner gathered his coat around himself and left first, the door swinging twice behind him before it settled, and no one moved to stop him or to comfort him, and no one followed him out to see where he went. The old cook's letter stayed on the table until the councilman folded it and set it in the record book, and the hired hand stood very straight the whole while, as though standing straight were a thing he had practiced. Outside, the wind had shifted west, carrying the smell of thawed mud and the first green edge of the grass that would come up thick by May. The rancher did not speak until they reached the wagon. He helped her up the same way he had that first cold night, though there was no need for it now, though her strength had long since returned, and then some. He did it because his hands wanted the work, and she let him, because she understood, by now, that this was how he said the things he did not say aloud. She settled the tin box in her lap, the lid still not quite shut, and looked back once at the saloon's crooked sign swinging on its chain, paint peeling at the corners, before she turned forward and did not look again. The wagon pulled out onto the frozen ruts, past the church, past the mercantile, past the last house at the edge of Split Creek, and neither of them spoke of what had just happened, because there was nothing left in it that needed saying twice. The calving came hard that year, the way it always did on the high plains. 3 nights of blood and steam, and the hired hand running lanterns from barn to house, until his boots wore a path in the mud. She was there for all of it, wrapped against the cold, with the baby asleep in a basket by the stove, calling out which cow needed turning before the rancher had finished pulling on his coat. By the time the last calf stood wet-legged and bawling in the straw, the ranch had 41 new head, and nobody in Split Creek called her a burden anymore, not even in the quiet rooms where such things used to be said freely. They married in the last week of April, after the frost had gone from the ground for good, and the creek ran loud with snowmelt. There was no church wedding, no reading of banns, no permission asked of anyone but themselves. The old preacher who had once looked past her in the street came out to the ranch at the rancher's plain request, said the words over them standing in the yard, with the hired hand, as witness, and the baby fussing in her father's arms, and then he was given supper and sent home before dark. She wore a blue dress she had sewn herself over the winter nights when sleep would not come, and the tin box sat that evening not tucked beneath a floorboard, nor hidden in a trunk, but square on the kitchen shelf beside the flour tin and the good knives, where anyone who came into that house could see it. The rancher did not make speeches. He never had. But that night, after the hired hand had gone to his own bunk and the baby had finally settled, he stood in the kitchen doorway a long while, watching her set the 11 cards in order on the table, sorting them by season, the way her mother once had, and he said only that the house had been too quiet for 11 years, and he did not intend to let it go quiet again. She did not answer that with words either. She reached for his scarred hand, the one that had lifted her out of a wagon bed of grain sacks on a black October night when she had nowhere left in the world to go, and held it the way a person holds something they mean to keep. Outside, the cattle moved slow and dark against the new grass, and the wind that had carried her out of Split Creek carried nothing now but the ordinary sound of a ranch settling into another season, one that would ask, at last, nothing more of her than she was already glad to give.